What's up, y'all? B Dougie here, and I'm super happy to give another talk at the ViteConf. So, last couple years, I've given different types of talk around the same subject, which is looking at open source data, and this is going to be focused on the culture of the Vite ecosystem. So, I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to kind of rush through a few slides, and everything's recorded. And would love for anybody to hit me up if you have any questions after. But did want to point out earlier this year, I did have a conversation with Evan about the Vite ecosystem. And would love for everyone to listen to the whole 40 minutes of this conversation. But what we were focused on in the conversation was like, why is Vite everywhere? Like, why is it the cornerstone of so many front end tools, really just generally in front end tooling? It's actually very interesting. And we cover that in the podcast, but I'll focus on a small portion of that. Also wanted to point out of the day of this recording today, I saw Vite actually, I thought it would be useful to put in my slides, but Vite, 15 million downloads per week, which is absolutely amazing. Wanted to point out my trajectory personally building open source started around this point, around the Vite, I think 1.0, 2.0 days. Actually, I already forgot what the actual version was that launched early 2021. But at that point is when I started using Vite, and we started using it in a small project, side project for open source, where we were building our own meta React framework. We never launched it or productized it or anything like that. It just sort of existed. We don't still maintain it, but it got me really involved in Vite on the earlier days. So I mentioned open source. This is the product that I work on day to day and talk about all the time. So bear with me as I use open source to share some of the storytelling and data as well. And then also should say I'm B Dougie as well. All my links, Chief Software Officer, you can find here. So going back to why is Vite everywhere? So Vite has 61,000 stars. And I think sometimes we could always fall over of like focusing on stars as the best, I guess, a metric to identify success. And I think actually stars is not one of the best metrics. Like anything over 15,000 stars, honestly, anything over 1,000 stars, you're good. Like you don't have to focus on stars anymore. There's other things you could focus on, which in particular a year ago, or actually last fall, we focused on trying to develop this sort of metric called confidence. And it's not even sort of, we actually have this in our application today. And the idea is like any folks who stars a project, forks a project, should have like basically what we call confidence, a confidence rating to approaching a project for a contribution. Now, this is the URL. I showed that before, but I'm going to highlight the confidence in particular on what we call repo pages. So this is freely available. You can search for any repo. I'm going to focus this conversation around Vite today, but you could search for any other repo and see the same data. But 70% in the last 6 months of all folks who interact with the Vite repo have a chance of making a contribution or have made a contribution to open source. This is actually really fascinating because when we sort of crunch the numbers, on average, you're going to look at 15 to 25%. So Vite's above, like right within the average mark, but high is like 30%. 30% is going to be pretty high. And like we've seen for more projects that are more like plugin based, like where you're just adding plugins to an ecosystem, like kind of like the VS Code repo or similar projects like the Nix OS projects, those tend to have a higher confidence because you're going to interact, you're going to add a plugin directly to that repo, and it's like the lower bar imagery. Also, markdown projects are going to have like a super high confidence as well. But thought that was super fascinating because Vite itself is pretty approachable. Now, early days, I went back to old PRs for Vite, and I saw one of the earliest ones, PR number 12, Docs PR, got merged by Evan. Earlier days, you're going to see a lot of this. Here's PR 41 from Underfin. PR, another little not even low effort, like a couple files changed, get merged by Evan. Early days, PR number 41, only a month later, 4x the amount of PRs. But when you look at a year later, same person, Underfin, 3,800 PRs later, you have more structure. You have Patak now approving PRs and merging them. You have governance set up within a project. And you find that there's now a centralized team, a core team that's kind of pulling more people from the outside, which is going to be the second metric, which I'll talk about, which is why is Vite everywhere? It's really the outside contribution, eventually that sort of rates of self-selection. And I studied statistics in college. Actually, I learned how to code while getting my MBA and learned a bunch about stats and statistics and business calc and stuff like that. And rate of self-selection is pretty common of like when you have a core team, how much folks come back to the inner circle or have opportunity to even make a contribution in the inner circle. And the way we represent this back on the repo page is through this chart. where we can identify things like outside contributions. So in the last 6 months, 177 contributions, 125 of those came from the outside. Now, this is not inclusive. These are basically inclusive of PR. So if anybody YOLOs directly to the main branch, like we're not counting that. If your releases happen through a different process, we're just counting purely outside contribution in PR form. Pretty fascinating. I think projects like NixOS or projects like VS Code, they take contribution on the outside, but they're all specifically high confidence, add plugins directly to that repo. Different sort of pattern, but yeah, I would say like this is very interesting to look at. And I point this out because the way we sort of identify outside contribution are folks with merge access within the project. So here we got folks who we can mark as maintainer because they have merge access. Other folks who don't have merge access, not maintainers. That's how we identify those. Another thing I would want to point out is like engagement. Now, when I used to work at GitHub, and I don't think I mentioned this already, but a lot of people know this already about me, but worked at GitHub, we identified top 100 projects not based on stars, identified that with unique issue authors. And having unique issue authors is a really good way to identify engagement. Also with PR commits and collectively of issue comments and alongside of reviews makes a really good formula for engagement. We have a little more complicated, but the way we identify this is here in our workspaces. So I've actually dropped in a bunch of repos in a dashboard, what we call workspaces, called Vite Ecosystem 2024. These are all projects that are dependent on Vite. And you can see across the board, super high engagement, super high, what we call activity here. And I thought that was fascinating to also point out where you're seeing a lot of, even 4 years into this game, you see a lot of vibrancy and a lot of energy coming from not just Vite projects, but projects that depend on Vite as well, which is pretty cool. Now, one thing I'll point out is the lottery factor. And lottery factor, you'll see across the board, some are high, some are pretty low. The idea of lottery factor, like folks end up winning the lottery, there's a chance they might not come back and make a contribution. And I bring that up because you might hear this as bus factor, but in the context of being a little more positive spin of why people maybe not come back to make a contribution, lottery factor is it. And it's pointing out, like we've got folks, we got the Nux team, which has a very core group, but then we have a moderate lottery factor for folks like Vite. And then we've got high for across the board for other smaller core teams. Astro's pretty unique where they have a pretty good distribution of contribution. And again, I would say lottery factor, whether it's high or low, it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just more of an observation for folks to react to. There are good reasons for why you would not have tons of outside contribution. There's a great reason for why you would. Cool. And then the other thing I'd point out is in this table where you make a workspace, you can see the confidence across the board. So like analog is a 23%, but Vitesse is actually really interesting, which is a 35%. So the barrier of entry, the opportunity for folks to make contributions to Vitesse, completely different than any project across the board. And then the last thing I want to mention is like we've been spending a lot of time, like we as an open source, looking at this type of data, kind of understanding like, okay, and we had this hypothesis of like there are clear like strategic players within the Vite ecosystem, folks building the movers and shakers. I call them tastemakers in particular, who are like building the sort of future of this ecosystem. And we wanted to build like a thing called Star Search. And Star Search is there's a show in the 90s where you would Ed McMahon would discover people like Beyonce and Justin Timberlake. And I wanted to find developers who are on the up or up and coming, very similar to like early days in the Vite ecosystem. Sort of find like Anthony Fu or Batak as well. And so we put this together. It's basically just like everyone else is doing AI. We've got a bunch of agents who are going through structured data, specifically in pull requests and with issues, and basically providing a very quick search and lookup across a ton of data to answer questions pretty quickly. So I'll move myself over to the right a little bit because Star Search itself, it's going to be a pop-up on top of that same workspace. We have other iterations. We're actually open to a ton of feedback on this because we don't know what the perfect interaction of this. It might be just like generating reports rather than chat interaction. But the idea is I'm asking a question like who has been working on relevant contributions within this workspace. And I can get really quickly folks like Toby from the Redwood project and folks like Dak and what they've done recently within the projects I'm looking at right here. So a lot of times I don't know what's happening, or I don't know. Actually, I didn't know the entire Vite ecosystem, what I sort of made up of So I was able to sort of query and find out more thoughts on being able to display folks like Anthony and seeing his profile and seeing that his Oscar is a metric, a combination of personal metrics of contribution quality and confidence, and sway, which is your ability to add commentary and conversations to repositories. His Oscar is going to be a top 1%, 262. Brandon Roberts, who specifically works with me on open source, but also maintaining and building the analog project, which is built on Vite, kind of bringing Vite into the Angular space. And then we also have Toby, who I called out before, who I discovered from doing Star Search, who is bringing Vite into the core, from the core team into Redwood.js. So why is Vite everywhere? Answer that question with like a clip and a quote from Evan Yu. I won't play it here because I don't have time, but like great contributors make a great ecosystem. And it really comes down to that. Vite does a really good job of providing a path and like really just giving you enough of the deal up front so you can be dangerous and really solve problems within your own ecosystem. So whether you're building a framework or you're just trying to improve performance of really improve developer experience, I think that's really at the heart of like why Vite is winning and in so many different areas. But I wouldn't even call it winning. It's just Vite's just doing a really good job and remarkable in a bunch of different areas. So that's it. I did show off these dev cards in a couple slides ago. If you want to check it out, you can see your data. If you have any questions or feedback, would love to talk about the data you saw. And I'll be around I'll be around. Find me on the internet. All right. And then remember, if you don't got sauce, then you lost. See ya.